The first thing Ethan noticed about 713 Hollow Lane was the quiet. Not the peaceful, lazy kind of quiet, but a silence so complete it felt wrong, as if even the birds avoided the place. The driveway was cracked, weeds sprouting in jagged lines like veins on brittle skin. The house stood at the end of a long row of nearly identical homes, yet it felt separate, as if it had distanced itself from its neighbors on purpose. Ethan's mother parked their beat-up sedan in front of the house, cutting the engine with a sigh. "This is it," she said, forcing a smile. "Our fresh start." Ethan stared at the house. It loomed above them, its faded white paint peeling in long strips, exposing the graying wood beneath. The windows were dark, like watching eyes. Even at 10 years old, Ethan wasn't naive. He knew his mom was trying her best after the divorce, stretching every dollar to give them some semblance of stability. But this house didn't feel like stability. It felt like a mistake. "I don't like it," Ethan said quietly. His mother's smile faltered. "We don't have to like it," she replied, opening her door. "We just have to make it work." Inside, the house was worse. It smelled of mildew and something faintly metallic. The wooden floors groaned under their weight, and the air was thick, heavy, as though it hadn't been disturbed in decades. Ethan's room was upstairs at the end of the hallway. It was small, with slanted ceilings and a single window overlooking the backyard. He dropped his bag on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed, his fingers tracing patterns on the faded quilt. It felt wrong, sitting there, as though he were trespassing. The first night was uneventful, though Ethan barely slept. The house was too quiet, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every shadow seemed to stretch and shift in the moonlight, and the occasional creak of the floorboards sounded deliberate, like footsteps. When morning came, he told himself he was being ridiculous. It was just an old house. The following week was spent unpacking and settling in. Ethan tried to focus on school, but the house lingered in his thoughts. Every time he returned home, it felt as though the temperature dropped a few degrees. His mother seemed oblivious, throwing herself into work and household chores with a frenetic energy that left little room for conversation. But Ethan couldn't ignore the subtle changes. The first real incident happened on a Tuesday evening. Ethan was in his room finishing his homework when he heard the unmistakable sound of humming. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of his desk lamp. He froze, his pencil hovering above the paper, straining to listen. The melody was soft, almost sweet, but it didn't come from the hallway or the yard. It was coming from inside the walls. He ran downstairs to find his mother in the kitchen, scrubbing a pan with such force that her knuckles were white. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Hear what?" she replied without looking up. "The humming. It sounded like a woman." His mother stopped scrubbing and turned to him, her expression unreadable. "It's an old house, Ethan," she said, her voice flat. "It makes noises. Don't let your imagination run wild." But it wasn't his imagination. Over the next few days, the house grew bolder. Ethan would hear whispers when he was alone, faint and fleeting, like the murmur of a crowd just out of earshot. His belongings began to move, small things at first, like his toothbrush appearing on the windowsill or his books rearranging themselves on the shelf. He tried to tell his mother, but she dismissed him every time, her patience wearing thin. One night, Ethan woke to the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy, echoing through the house like the ticking of a clock. He lay frozen in bed, clutching his blanket as the steps grew louder, closer. When they stopped outside his door, he held his breath, waiting. Then came the knock. It was soft at first, almost hesitant, but it grew louder, more insistent. Summoning every ounce of courage, Ethan whispered, "Mom?" His voice sounded small and fragile in the dark. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the empty hallway. Moonlight spilled through the window at the far end, casting long, skeletal shadows on the floor. Ethan's heart pounded as he stepped into the hall, his bare feet cold against the wooden boards. The air felt heavier here, pressing down on him like a physical weight. He turned toward his mother's room and froze. A figure stood at the end of the hallway. It was faint, barely more than a silhouette, but its presence was undeniable. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply stood there, watching. Ethan stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. When he blinked, the figure was gone. The next morning, Ethan tried again to tell his mother. She was at the kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. "Mom," he began hesitantly, "I think there's something wrong with this house." She sighed, setting her cup down. "Ethan, we've been over this. It's just old. You're letting your imagination get the better of you." "No, it's not just that," he insisted. "I saw someone last night, in the hallway." His mother stared at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she shook her head. "Ethan, you're under a lot of stress. Maybe we both are, but there's no one in this house but us." Her dismissal stung, but Ethan didn't press the issue. He knew she wouldn't believe him. She was too focused on holding everything together, on pretending that they were fine. But Ethan knew the truth. The house was alive, and it didn't want them there. A week later, Ethan discovered the attic. He hadn't noticed the narrow staircase before, hidden behind a door in the hallway. The steps were steep and narrow, creaking loudly with each step. At the top, the attic was dimly lit, its only window covered in grime. The air was stale, thick with the scent of dust and decay. In the corner of the attic, a rocking chair swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Ethan's eyes were drawn to a small wooden box on the floor. Inside, he found old photographs, black and white images of children with hollow eyes and somber expressions. One photo caught his attention. A little girl standing in front of the house, her face partially obscured by shadows. Written in shaky handwriting on the back was the name Emily. That night, the dreams began. Ethan dreamt of Emily standing at the foot of his bed. She wore a tattered dress, her hair hanging in limp strands over her pale face. Her eyes were dark, empty voids. "Help me," she whispered, her voice a broken melody. Ethan woke in a cold sweat, his heart pounding. The house grew colder after that. The whispers turned to laughter, high-pitched and childlike, but with an edge that made Ethan's skin crawl. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision, darting away whenever he tried to focus on them. The air felt heavier, suffocating, as though the house were closing in on him. His mother began to change too. She grew distant, her movements sluggish and mechanical. She spent hours staring out the kitchen window, her fingers drumming absently on the countertop. When Ethan tried to talk to her, she barely seemed to register his presence. One night, Ethan woke to the sound of humming again. This time it was louder, clearer, and it was coming from the attic. He crept up the stairs, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The attic door stood ajar, the faint glow of candlelight spilling into the hallway. Inside, the rocking chair swayed violently, its creak echoing through the room. The air was icy, his breath visible in the dim light. Emily stood in the center of the room, her hollow eyes fixed on him. "You found me," she said, her voice a haunting echo. Ethan stood frozen, his breath hitching as Emily's hollow eyes bore into him. Her small frame seemed to flicker in the dim candlelight, as if she wasn't entirely there. The rocking chair creaked behind her, the sound steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. "What do you want?" Ethan managed to whisper, his voice cracking. Emily tilted her head, her tangled hair falling over one shoulder. "He won't let me leave," she said softly, her voice like the rustling of leaves. "None of us can." Before Ethan could respond, the room grew colder. The shadows in the corners seemed to swell, bleeding into the light like ink and water. The rocking chair stopped abruptly, and the silence that followed was suffocating. "He's coming," Emily whispered, her face twisting in fear. Run! Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He bolted down the attic stairs, his feet barely touching the steps. The air in the house felt alive, pressing against him like invisible hands. The hallway stretched unnaturally long, the flickering light from his flashlight barely piercing the darkness. Behind him, he could hear the slow, deliberate creak of footsteps. He stumbled into his room, slamming the door shut and pressing his back against it. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. The house seemed to hum around him, the walls vibrating faintly as if alive. Then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a jolt of terror through him. "Ethan." The voice was low and gravelly, dripping with malice. It wasn't his mother's voice. He backed away from the door, his eyes darting around the room for something, anything to defend himself. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like the door would splinter under the force. Ethan grabbed his desk chair, holding it in front of him like a shield. Suddenly, the knocking stopped. The silence that followed was worse, stretching out like a taut wire about to snap. Ethan's hand trembled, the chair slipping from his grasp. He could hear his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Then, the voice came again, this time from inside the room. "Why are you here?" Ethan spun around, his flashlight sweeping across the room. For a moment, he thought he was alone. Then he saw it, a figure standing in the corner, its shape barely visible in the flickering light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, twin orbs of malevolence that seemed to pierce through him. "You shouldn't have come," it said, its voice echoing with 1,000 whispers. Ethan's legs gave out, and he collapsed to the floor. The figure moved closer, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were being pulled by invisible strings. Ethan closed his eyes, bracing for the end, but it never came. When Ethan woke, the house was eerily still. The first rays of sunlight filtered through his window, casting a warm glow over the room. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare. But the wooden box from the attic sat on his desk, its lid slightly ajar. The photograph of Emily lay on top, her hollow eyes staring back at him. His mother found him in the kitchen later that morning, staring blankly at a bowl of cereal he hadn't touched. "Rough night?" she asked, her tone light but her expression wary. Ethan nodded, unsure how to begin. "Mom, there's something wrong with this house." Her smile faltered, and for a brief moment, Ethan thought he saw fear flicker in her eyes, but she quickly masked it, shaking her head. "It's just your imagination, sweetie." "No, it's not," Ethan insisted, his voice rising. "I've seen things. There's a girl in the attic. Her name's Emily. And there's something else." His mother's face paled, and she turned away, busying herself with the dishes. "Enough, Ethan," she said quietly. "We can't afford to move again. We have to stay." Ethan opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. There was no point. His mother didn't want to believe him. Or maybe she couldn't. That night, Ethan made a decision. He couldn't stay in the house another day without answers. Armed with his flashlight and a notebook, he climbed back into the attic. The rocking chair was still, its silence almost mocking. The air was heavy, pressing against his skin like a damp cloth. He flipped through the photographs again, searching for clues. Most of them were of children, dozens of them, all with the same hollow-eyed stare. On the back of one, he found a date, June 3rd, 1974. Below it was a single word, taken. Ethan's blood ran cold. He turned the photograph over, his hands shaking. The child in the picture wasn't Emily. It was him. A sharp bang jolted him from his thoughts. The attic door slammed shut, plunging the room into darkness. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to creep closer, swallowing the edges of the room. Ethan's flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in complete darkness. "Why are you here?" The voice from before growled, closer now. Ethan's breath came in short, panicked gasps. "What do you want?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. The shadows swirled, coalescing into the tall figure from before. It towered over him, its glowing eyes fixed on his. "This is my house," it said, "and you belong to me." Ethan stumbled backward, his hands scrabbling for anything to defend himself. His fingers closed around the wooden box, and he hurled it at the figure. It passed through the shadows harmlessly, but the photograph fluttered to the floor. Emily's voice cut through the darkness, sharp and commanding. "Leave him alone!" The figure hissed, recoiling as Emily's form appeared beside Ethan. Her hollow eyes burned with defiance as she stepped between him and the shadows. "You can't have him," she said. The shadows roared, their form unraveling like smoke caught in a gust of wind. The attic trembled, the walls groaning as if the house itself were in pain. Emily turned to Ethan, her expression softening. "Run," she said, "and don't look back." Ethan didn't hesitate. He bolted down the attic stairs, the house shaking violently around him. The air was filled with the sound of whispers and screams, a cacophony that made his ears ring. He found his mother in the living room, her face pale with terror. "We have to go," he shouted, grabbing her arm. They ran into the night, the house groaning in protest behind them. As they reached the edge of the yard, Ethan glanced back. The house seemed to collapse in on itself, its walls crumbling and its windows shattering. For a brief moment, he thought he saw Emily standing in the attic window, her face calm and serene. She raised a hand in farewell before the house disappeared into the darkness. Ethan and his mother never spoke of 713 Hollow Lane again. They moved to a small apartment on the other side of town, and life slowly returned to normal. But sometimes, late at night, Ethan would wake to the faint sound of humming, and he couldn't help but wonder if Emily had truly been set free, or if she was still waiting, trapped in the ruins of that cursed house.